Iran has now confirmed the purchase of Russia's Su-35 fighter jets, and that is happening in the middle of a regional war that has already entered its fifth week, pushed Brent crude above $107 a barrel, and left more than 300 U.S. service members injured across the broader conflict. Reuters reported that a senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guards confirmed the Su-35 purchase, although he did not give the number of aircraft or a delivery timeline. That is why this story is so dangerous. This is not just about Iran buying new fighter jets. This is about a country with an aging air force trying to upgrade one of the weakest parts of its military at the exact moment the Middle East is already under extreme pressure. For years, Iran has relied on a patchwork fleet of older Russian aircraft and U.S.-made planes dating back to before the 1979 revolution. Even a limited Su-35 upgrade could force both Israel and the United States to take a much harder look at the future of air power in the region. And the timing makes this even more alarming. In just the last few days, AP reported that Russia is also sending upgraded drones to Iran, while the wider war has driven U.S. gas prices above $4 per gallon and escalated attacks across the Gulf. That means this is no longer just a headline about one weapons deal. It may be part of a much larger military relationship between Moscow and Tehran, one that could reshape deterrence, air defense planning, and escalation risks for both Washington and Tel Aviv. So tonight, we break down what Iran may actually gain from the Su-35, why Israel could see this as a serious new air threat, and why the United States may be looking at something even bigger than the jets themselves. Because if Tehran is moving from drones and missiles toward a more capable fighter force with Russian help, then this may not be just another arms deal. It could be the start of a more dangerous phase in the balance of power across the Middle East. The first thing to understand is this. Iran has now publicly acknowledged that it purchased Russia's Su-35 fighter jets. That matters because for a long time, reports about a possible Su-35 deal circulated through military analysts, regional media, and defense speculation. But this was one of the clearest official signals yet from Tehran itself. Reuters reported that a senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guards confirmed the purchase, even though he did not specify how many aircraft were involved or when they would arrive. Reuters.com. And that point is critical. Right now, the most solid part of this story is not a dramatic delivery claim or a viral number floating online. It is the fact that Iran itself has acknowledged the purchase. That alone is enough to raise alarms, because Iran's air force has long been one of the weakest links in its overall military structure. Reuters noted that Iran still operates aircraft that date back to the era before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, including older U.S. made fighter jets acquired under the Shah, alongside aging Russian aircraft added later. Reuters.com. That means this is not a cosmetic upgrade. This is not the kind of story where a country simply buys one more system to add to an already modern force. Iran is trying to modernize a military capability that has been outdated for decades. For years, Tehran has compensated for that weakness by investing heavily in missiles, drones, proxy networks, and asymmetric warfare. But fighter aviation has remained a vulnerability. So, when Iran confirms the purchase of a far more advanced Russian platform, the concern is obvious. Tehran may be trying to close one of the most important gaps in its military posture. Reuters.com. And this is where the story gets more serious. Even before we talk about what the Su-35 can do, the deal itself sends a message. It tells Israel, the United States, and every military planner watching the region that Iran is not content to remain only a missile and drone power. It suggests that Tehran wants to be seen as a more complete military actor, one that can threaten the region not only through proxies, rockets, and unmanned systems, but through more capable manned air power as well. That shift in perception matters because in the Middle East, deterrence often depends as much on what your rivals believe you are becoming as on what you can already do. And the timing adds even more weight. AP reported in the past few days that Russia is also sending upgraded drones to Iran, indicating that military cooperation between Moscow and Tehran may be deepening across multiple categories rather than stopping at one fighter jet deal. appnews.com. So this is not just about a jet purchase on paper. It may be part of a broader pattern in which Iran gains access to more advanced Russian military support at a time when the wider region is already unstable. The bottom line is simple. Iran has not just created another headline. It has signaled that it wants to modernize one of the weakest parts of its military, and it is doing so with Russian help. That is why this story is not being watched as a narrow defense procurement issue. It is being watched as a possible indicator of where the next phase of regional military competition may be heading. So what exactly is the Su-35, and why does it matter so much? The Su-35 is widely viewed as one of Russia's most advanced non-stealth fighter aircraft, a 4++ generation jet designed for air superiority, long-range engagement, and multi-role combat. It is built to fly fast, carry a heavy weapons load, operate at long range, and track multiple targets at once. In practical terms, that means it is the kind of platform designed to pressure enemy aircraft, contest airspace, and complicate the job of any military trying to operate freely overhead. And the numbers help explain why this matters. Open-source defense reporting and manufacturer-linked data commonly describe the Su-35 as capable of speeds around Mach 2.25, with a combat radius often cited at over 1,500 kilometers depending on mission profile, and an overall ferry range that can stretch much farther with external fuel. It is also often described as carrying a powerful radar and up to 12 hardpoints for missiles, bombs, and other munitions. While exact combat performance depends on pilot training, maintenance, support systems, and real battlefield conditions, the basic point is clear. This is not an old interceptor being pulled out of storage. It is a serious high-performance fighter platform. To wet, punt, gobcom. Now, that does not mean Iran would suddenly dominate the skies. That would be a major exaggeration. Israel still maintains one of the most advanced air forces in the region, with highly trained crews, strong intelligence support, deep strike experience, and stealth assets. The United States, of course, remains vastly stronger overall. But that is also not the real issue. The issue is that even a limited number of more advanced fighters could force a recalculation. Because military balances do not always shift when one side becomes stronger than everyone else. Sometimes they shift when one side becomes just strong enough to make the other side's planning harder, slower, riskier, and more expensive. That is where the Su-35 becomes a genuine concern. If Iran can field even a modest number of these aircraft in operational condition, they could improve Tehran's ability to patrol key airspace, pressure hostile aircraft, reinforce air defense zones, and create more uncertainty around future strike scenarios. In a crisis, uncertainty matters almost as much as raw firepower. And this is especially important for Israel. For years, Israel's advantage has depended not just on stronger technology, but on the confidence that it can act with speed, precision, and relative freedom if it decides the threat is serious enough. A more capable Iranian fighter force would not erase that advantage, but it could make Israeli planners think more carefully about routes, timing, electronic warfare, escorts, and attrition risk. In other words, the Su-35 does not need to make Iran dominant to make it more dangerous. The same logic applies to the United States. American strategy in the Middle East is built on a combination of air power, bases, naval positioning, intelligence networks, and regional alliances. If Iran becomes more capable in the air, even incrementally, then U.S. planners have to account for a broader and more complex threat picture. Not because the Su-35 alone changes everything, but because it could become part of a larger military posture that includes missiles, drones, naval pressure, and proxy escalation. And that is why this aircraft matters far beyond the jet itself. On paper, the Su-35 is a fighter, but strategically, it is a signal. It signals that Iran may be trying to move from a military model built mostly around missiles and drones toward one that also includes more credible manned air power. And if that transition continues, then every future crisis involving Iran could become more difficult to predict and more dangerous to control. For Israel, the danger here is not that Iran suddenly becomes stronger than the Israeli Air Force. That is not the claim, and it would be misleading. Israel still holds a major technological, training, and operational advantage in the air. It has one of the most battle-tested air forces in the region, strong intelligence integration, advanced electronic warfare, and stealth assets that Iran does not match. But military planners do not worry only about who is stronger. They worry about what becomes harder, and that is exactly where the Su-35 enters the picture. Because Israel's real advantage has never been based only on having better aircraft. It has been based on freedom of action. The ability to monitor, deter, threaten, and if necessary, strike with speed and precision has been one of the pillars of Israeli strategy for years. A more capable Iranian fighter force would not erase that freedom overnight, but it could begin to narrow it. And once freedom of action becomes more contested, every future decision becomes more complicated. That is why even a limited Su-35 presence matters. A more modern Iranian fighter fleet could force Israeli planners to rethink how they approach long-range missions, defensive readiness, escort planning, radar exposure, and the broader risk of escalation in contested airspace. The issue is not just whether Israel could still win in a direct confrontation. The issue is whether the cost, complexity, and uncertainty of any operation would rise. And in military terms, that can be a very big deal. Because if Israel has to devote more attention to Iranian manned air power, then it may also have to spread more resources across multiple layers of the threat environment at the same time. Missiles, drones, proxy attacks, air defenses, and now potentially a more credible fighter component. That changes the burden on planning. It changes what has to be tracked, and it changes the number of things that can go wrong in a fast-moving crisis. This becomes even more serious when you place it inside the current regional context. Reuters reported that Iran confirmed the Su-35 purchase, while AP, in recent days, reported that Russia was also sending upgraded drones to Iran. That suggests the concern is not just about one aircraft platform in isolation. The larger fear is that Tehran may be improving multiple parts of its military toolkit at once. Reuters.com, appnews.com. And that is where the phrase, a new nightmare, starts to make sense. Not because Israel is suddenly powerless, but because the strategic picture becomes thicker, more dangerous, and less predictable. A region that was already dealing with missile salvos, drone warfare, proxy escalation, and pressure on shipping lanes may now also have to think more seriously about Iran trying to rebuild meaningful manned air power with Russian backing. In a region this tense, even a modest shift in capability can create a disproportionate effect on fear, signaling, and military calculations. There is also a psychological layer to this story that matters a great deal. Deterrence in the Middle East is not just about what weapons exist. It is about what rival governments believe those weapons may allow in the next confrontation. If Israeli decision-makers begin to believe that Iran is entering a more advanced phase of military modernization, then the Su-35 deal does more than strengthen Iran's arsenal. It changes expectations. And once expectations shift, military postures often shift with them. So from Israel's point of view, the problem is not simply that Iran may get better jets. The problem is that Tehran may be signaling something bigger, that it no longer wants to be seen only as a missile power, a drone power, or a proxy power. It may want to be seen as a state building toward a more complete and modern military posture. And if that is true, Israel may have to start preparing not just for the Iran it has known, but for the Iran that may be emerging next. For the United States, the Su-35 story is not just about one fighter jet deal. Washington is looking at something much larger than the aircraft itself. The real concern is whether this is part of a broader military alignment between Russia and Iran, one that could make the next Middle East crisis far more dangerous for U.S. forces, regional bases, allies, and overall deterrence. That is why American planners are unlikely to see this as an isolated procurement story. The jet matters, yes, but what matters even more is the pattern. Because in recent days, AP reported that Russia is also sending upgraded drones to Iran, suggesting that military cooperation between Moscow and Tehran may be deepening across multiple systems rather than staying confined to a single deal. appnews.com. And when you combine that with Iran's missile capabilities, regional proxy networks, naval pressure points, and now a possible push to modernize its fighter fleet, the picture starts to look far more complex from Washington's point of view. That complexity matters because the United States does not operate in the region through one single tool. American power in the Middle East depends on a network: air power, intelligence, naval deployments, regional bases, missile defense coordination, and the confidence of partners such as Israel and Gulf states. If Iran starts improving more than one layer of its military at the same time, then the U.S. has to plan for a more interconnected threat environment. And that means more than simply asking, can Iran challenge America in the air? That is not really the central question. The central question is this: can Iran, with Russian support, become difficult enough across multiple domains that it raises the cost of U.S. pressure, slows response times, complicates crisis management, and forces Washington into tougher military decisions? That is a very different issue, because strategy is not only about who has the biggest military, it is also about who can complicate the battlefield enough to alter the choices of the stronger side. If Iran becomes harder to deter from the air, while also remaining dangerous through drones, missiles, proxies, and maritime disruption, then even a stronger power like the United States has to devote more resources, more planning time, and more caution to every scenario. This matters even more because the broader war has already been expensive and destabilizing. Reuters reported that the current regional conflict has injured more than 300 U.S. service members, while pressure on energy markets has helped push Brent crude above $107 per barrel and U.S. gasoline above $4 per gallon in parts of the country. Reuters.com. So Washington is not evaluating this deal in a vacuum. It is evaluating it in the middle of an already costly confrontation. And that is why the Su-35 becomes politically and militarily sensitive for the United States. Because if this is only the beginning of a deeper Russia-Iran military channel, then Washington is not just facing one new aircraft type in the region. It may be facing a more adaptive Iranian military model, one that is trying to become harder to isolate, harder to intimidate, and harder to strike without risk. That possibility has consequences far beyond Tehran. It affects how the United States reassures Israel. It affects how Washington coordinates with Gulf partners. It affects force protection for bases and personnel. And it affects how seriously the Pentagon has to think about escalation ladders that are already becoming more dangerous by the week. So from Washington's perspective, the nightmare is not simply that Iran gets better jets. The nightmare is that Iran may be moving step by step toward a more complete military posture with Russian help, and that every step in that direction makes the next crisis harder to control, more expensive to manage, and more dangerous for American interests across the region. Now comes the most important question. Does this actually change the balance of power in the Middle East? The honest answer is not overnight. Iran, confirming the purchase of Su-35 fighter jets, does not suddenly erase Israel's air superiority, and it does not put Iran anywhere close to matching overall U.S. military power in the region. Reuters reporting itself is careful. Iran has acknowledged the purchase, but there is still no public confirmation in that report of the number of aircraft involved, the delivery schedule, or how quickly those jets could become fully operational inside Iran's military structure. Reuters.com. And that matters because military power is not built by hardware alone. A fighter jet is only as effective as the system around it. Pilot training, maintenance, logistics, command and control, munitions, radar integration, electronic warfare support, and the ability to keep aircraft mission-ready under pressure. So even if Iran is moving toward a more advanced air force, that does not mean the full strategic impact appears immediately. There is a difference between acquiring a platform and mastering it. But that is only one side of the story. Because strategic shifts do not always begin when a country becomes dominant. Sometimes they begin when a country becomes just capable enough to force everyone else to recalculate. And that may be exactly what this deal represents. If Iran succeeds in integrating even a modest number of Su-35s into a broader military posture that already includes missiles, drones, proxies, and regional pressure points, then the question is no longer whether Tehran can defeat Israel or the United States in a conventional air war. The question becomes whether Iran can create enough uncertainty, enough friction, and enough added risk to make future confrontations more dangerous and less predictable. That is how balances start to move. Not with one dramatic moment, not with one headline, but with a series of steps that slowly increase cost, complexity, and caution for every other player involved. And in the Middle East, perception can accelerate that process even faster than capability. If Israel believes Iran is entering a new phase of military modernization, Israeli planning may shift before the jets ever prove themselves in combat. If Washington believes Russia is helping Iran close multiple military gaps at once, U.S. Strategy may adapt before the full battlefield effect becomes visible. And if regional actors begin to believe that Tehran is becoming harder to pressure from the air, then deterrence itself begins to change. That is why the Su-35 deal matters even before it transforms anything on paper. Because it sends a signal. It tells the region that Iran is trying to evolve beyond the military model it has relied on for years. For a long time, Tehran's strength has been built around missiles, drones, proxies, and asymmetric pressure. Now, the message may be that Iran also wants to rebuild credible manned air power, not enough to replace those other tools, but enough to reinforce them. And if that happens, the consequences could be significant. A more complete Iranian military posture would not need to dominate the region to change it. It would only need to become harder to ignore, harder to deter, and harder to strike without consequence. So no, this does not instantly rewrite the regional power map. But yes, it could be the beginning of a more serious shift. And that is often how major changes start. Not with a sudden collapse of the old balance, but with a new capability that makes the old assumptions feel less secure than they did before. So what happens next? At this point, there are at least 3 realistic paths this story could take, and each of them matters for Israel, the United States, and the wider Middle East. Scenario 1. The deal is real, but the impact is slow. The first possibility is that the Su-35 purchase proves important politically, but limited militarily in the short term. That would mean Iran has made a real move toward upgrading its air force, but the actual operational effect takes time. Pilots need training, ground crews need technical support, weapons systems need integration, maintenance chains need to be established. And advanced aircraft are only dangerous at full potential when the entire support structure around them is functioning properly. In that scenario, the headline stays powerful, but the battlefield impact remains gradual. Even so, that would not make the story unimportant, because even a slow-moving modernization effort can still shape perception. Israel would still have to watch it. The U.S. would still have to account for it. And regional actors would still begin adjusting to the idea that Iran is no longer content with an outdated air force. So even the slow impact scenario carries strategic consequences. Scenario 2. Iran successfully integrates the Su-35 into a broader military strategy. The second scenario is much more serious. In this path, Iran does not treat the Su-35 as a symbolic trophy. It treats it as part of a larger redesign of military deterrence. That means the jets are folded into a broader system that includes missiles, drones, air defenses, surveillance, and regional pressure points. And if that happens, the Su-35 becomes more dangerous not just because of what it can do alone, but because of how it fits into a layered threat structure. That is the scenario that would most concern Israel and Washington. Because a more connected Iranian military posture would force outside powers to prepare for multiple problems at once. Not only missile threats, not only drone swarms, not only proxy escalation, but also a more credible manned fighter component that complicates air planning and raises the cost of any direct action. In that scenario, the Su-35 is not just an upgrade, it becomes a force multiplier. And once that happens, the next crisis in the region could look very different from the last one. Scenario 3. The symbolism of the deal triggers reactions before the jets even do. The third scenario may actually be the most dangerous in the near term, because sometimes in the Middle East, the perception of a military shift can trigger reactions before the military shift itself is fully real. If Israel begins to believe Iran is moving into a new phase of modernization, it may adjust its planning earlier. If Washington sees the Russia-Iran military channel expanding beyond one deal, it may harden its posture before the long-term results are visible. And if Tehran wants the Su-35 deal to signal strength, then that signal alone could start altering how deterrence works across the region. That means the jets do not even need to be fully operational to begin affecting behavior. The psychological effect could arrive before the tactical effect. And that matters because perception drives escalation. Once rivals begin to assume the balance is changing, they often move faster, prepare more aggressively, and become less willing to take risks based on old assumptions. In other words, a weapons deal can begin changing the strategic atmosphere even before it changes the actual battlefield. Why these 3 scenarios all point to the same conclusion. Whether the impact is slow, serious, or mainly psychological at first, all 3 scenarios point in the same direction. This story matters Because in every version, Iran is signaling an ambition to become more militarily complete, and that alone makes the region more tense. The exact speed of the shift is still uncertain. The final military effect is still uncertain, but the direction of the move is much clearer now. Tehran wants to be seen as improving one of the most outdated parts of its military and doing it with Russian backing, at a moment when the region is already deep in crisis. That is why this is not just another procurement story. It is a story about trajectory, about intent, and about the possibility that the next phase of confrontation in the Middle East may be more complex than the last. Iran's Su-35 purchase does not guarantee a dramatic military transformation tomorrow, but that is not the point. The point is that Tehran has now signaled something much bigger than a single defense deal. It has signaled intent. Intent to modernize, intent to close one of the oldest weaknesses in its military, and intent to do it with Russian support at a moment when the region is already under severe pressure. That is why this development matters so much to both Israel and the United States. For Israel, the concern is not that Iran suddenly becomes stronger across the board. The concern is that future operations may become harder, riskier, and less predictable if Tehran is no longer relying only on missiles, drones, and proxy warfare. A more modern fighter capability, even in limited form, could add another layer of danger to a region that is already saturated with threats. For the United States, the bigger fear may be even more strategic. Washington is not simply watching a jet purchase. It is watching the possibility of a deeper Russia-Iran military relationship taking shape in real time, one that could gradually strengthen Tehran across multiple domains and make future crises more expensive, more dangerous, and more difficult to control. And that is why this story should not be dismissed as just another headline. Because major shifts in the Middle East rarely begin with a single dramatic explosion. More often, they begin with one move that changes the assumptions everyone else has been relying on. One move that forces rivals to recalculate. One move that makes the next confrontation harder to predict. The Su-35 deal may turn out to be limited. It may take time. It may deliver less than Iran hopes. But even with all of those uncertainties, one thing is already clear. Iran wants the region to know that it is trying to build something more dangerous than the military posture it had before. And if that process continues, Israel and the United States will not just be watching a stronger Iran. They may be watching the beginning of a more unstable Middle East, one where the air war, the deterrence equation, and the path to the next crisis all become far more dangerous than they were yesterday. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to Redline Report and stay with us as we break down the next major shift in the world's most dangerous flashpoints.